Okay, hello everyone. Welcome back to the fourth episode of the Safe Podcast. Today I'm joined with a friend of mine who has a background in history. His name is Brian Patrick O'Malley, the most Irish name I've ever heard in my entire life. Gotta love it. Brian got his master's in history at the University of North Florida, and he's taught at Jones College, which is a college here in Jax, right?
That's right. But defunct a few years ago, but yeah, it used to be right here in Jacksonville.
Yeah, cool, man. What was it known for? Was it a liberal arts college or?
It was not, it was trying to branch out into that as it tried to adapt to, online and a new format. What it had been known for decades was a business college. And it also had a radio station. And SNL alum Joe Piscopo went there and worked at their radio station
Oh,
today. So,
okay.
so it was mostly known for radio and business.
Okay. Word, man. Um, but yeah, so anyways, my idea for this episode, viewers, is it's a little different from previous episodes in that we're not going to be talking about self-development practices or spirituality directly, but I thought that in the world we're living in, it would be interesting to get some historical context about how we got here and the development and progression of American values as they evolve through religion, our founding fathers, important documents, and so on. Because a lot of people have very strong opinions and no literacy about these subjects. So I just wanted to give myself and others a reality check by having someone with some formal education in these kinds of fields. So yeah, that's kind of the idea here. Probably won't be leaving with any new meditation rituals to try out today, but hopefully some information that might allow you to think clearly about things going on. But anyways, all right, Brian, let's get into it. So like I said, first I want to ask about the foundation of American values. So my first question to you is, in the framing of how did we get here, who were some important early American political thinkers and how did they shape what we have going on today?
But Washington isn't given a lot of credit as a thinker. In fact, the opening remark that people will make about him is that he wasn't a big intellectual, and I think that undermines some of the more important things he did in setting a tone. Of course, uh, he's emblematic in how horrific his life and his achievements were intertwined with the exploitation of enslavement, and you cannot dodge that. The story of his teeth being a major part of that. That is so gruesome. I guess we do need to start there. That it was customary then that poor people could sell their teeth to rich people who needed to fill some gaps. When you add to that enslavement, he did not approach. It looks like, although he may, in some, that he didn't exclude, he did not, in some cases, go towards free people to offer them market value. He got a number of his teeth uh, at a lower rate from people he enslaved. And that's pretty gruesome. I I think the brutality of everyday life then is something we overlook, but we have to remember that also sets a tone.
Sure.
What he doesn't get credit for in on a good light is that he tried to set a good tone when it came to the acceptance of Catholics and Jews, and by implication Muslims, because he, in a number of cases, would include Muslims in a list of people he was thinking of when he envisioned acceptance, when he was hiring workers. There's a passing line when he was hiring work. He was asking an agent to hire some people who had just arrived from Germany, and he goes, I guess that they had arrived in Maryland, and he wanted to hire a few skilled workers. And he goes, but they don't have to be Germans. They can be African, Asian, European. They can be Christians, Muslims, or Jews. You know, it's so he was he tried to set a tone of inclusivity, and a phrase he often repeated was all nations and religions. And that phrase, I think, separated from Washington's writing, became sort of embedded in New England thinking, and it was constantly being made fun of by advocates on the West Coast who were advocating Chinese exclusion, would constantly make fun of the idea, oh, you want this to be a place for all nations and religions. And eugenicists in the 20s who wanted to curtail Eastern European and Mediterranean and Asian immigration would make fun of the same phrase. And I don't think they realize that the people who are ripping down this phrase don't realize that it came from George Washington. So in some ways, although he was by no means perfect, and I mean far short of perfect, on that one, racists and anti-immigrant and anti-change people who have always kind of people who will say demographics is destiny are the kind of people who are constantly at war with Washington's best idea, one of his best ideas. And I think that's something he doesn't get enough credit for as a thinker. Because when it comes to thinkers, we're going to think of Madison, Jefferson, and Franklin. And Washington's going to be seen as, the military man of action. And he had some tutoring at the plantation, but he never went to college. So he's not given credit as an ideas man. But in a visceral sort of way, is one of the keynote things that we think of when we think of the good of America is accepting people from different nations and of a variety of religions. And that is largely going to come from him, but also Madison and others. But a lot of that's going to come from him. So I think he's undersold as a thinker.
Interesting that there was then a situation of these people who really championed inclusion and then these people who really opposed it from other parts of the nation. Kind of reminds me of something, but reminds me of something modern. Um, what I want to ask is, what were the early defenses of religious freedom? To me, it kind of would make sense if back then we were just like, okay, everyone having a homogenous, seeing the world the exact same way would have benefits. It seems complicated. I mean, how did these thinkers defend their position?
Some of them had a premise, and Chris Benecke is one writer who sort of has documented this. That there was an sort of unspoken consensus of almost universalism, that it was very impolite to talk about people from other religions. Well, they're going to go to hell because they believe the wrong thing. And there were people who believed that, but one of the underlying things was maybe not universalism, some would call it cosmopolitanism, where you saw if they were good people, then they might be Zoroastrian, they might be Muslim, and gosh, they might even be Catholic. But they still love the cat, by the way.
Oh,
Um,
thank you.
yeah. So there's this idea that there's merit in all these different religions, and you tend to think of them as all teaching morality being the important thing.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of this justification for it was before evangelicalism was the most powerful presence, even though it wasn't the power broker we kind of think of it now. In a
Mm-hmm.
lot of states, it was still being persecuted, like in New England, it was a very second class sort of thing. But but the Baptists were on board with um, this idea of accepting all people and having freedom that was as broad as possible. And Denise, is it Spellman? In her book on Jefferson's Quran, that Muslims in many ways were theoretical, even though, of course, there were Muslims in America, most of them enslaved. But to say that, oh, well, the Constitution with its ban on religious tests, it means that Jews and Muslims could become senators or even president. And some people were happy about that, and some people were horrified. And a few people were like, well, yeah, it clearly is possible, but it's not likely. And so there were people who sort of begrudgingly accepted it because they knew if Muslims were theoretically free to hold office in America, it meant that Baptists and Presbyterians probably didn't have to worry too much.
Mm.
So theoretical Muslims, that was one of the rhetorical devices that, and people who hated the Constitution because of the ban on religious tests would try to cash in on anti-Muslim, anti-Jewish, even anti-Quaker sentiments. There
Mm.
was one, yeah, there was one editorial that said, look, this ban on religious tests, this is before the Bill of Rights. It's part of the original Constitution, and where it's, that there'll be no religious qualifications for federal office. And he said, well, a Quaker could become president, and then they're going to outlaw self-defense, and they're going to stir up a slave revolt, and they'll make it illegal for white enslavers to defend themselves because they're pacifists and anti-slavery. Another said the Catholics, if the Catholic became president, there was some other risk. A Jewish American could become president, and he'd make us rebuild Jerusalem. And a Muslim, and they'll outlaw belief in the Trinity. Or there was all these fears about. It was where he tried to cash in on every bigotry that a white Protestant could possibly have, and tried to say, just reject the Constitution because the last thing you want is a Catholic or a Quaker in office. And unfortunately, there was, well, Richard Nixon isn't really famous for just being Quaker or for great encapsulating their ideals perfectly, but yeah, so it's kind of weird. So theoretical Muslims were one way to sort of.
What do you exactly mean by that?
What's that?
What do you exactly mean by a theoretical Muslim?
Oh, well, there was a lot of like your neighbor then, as a free neighbor wasn't likely to be Muslim.
Okay.
So it was strictly hypothetical for the most, because there wasn't at that time a way. Again, there were large numbers of enslaved Muslims, and they were somehow, invisible in this particular debate. You even see a woman and probably a young girl in Washington's slave inventories, little Fatima and big Fatima. So that, or Fatima, Fatima. I'm giving like the Catholic pronunciation of it. So clearly Muslim names in his in the list of people he enslaved. But so there were Muslims here, but they weren't thinking of those Muslims. Those are obviously African Muslims were not directly part of that debate.
Mm-hmm.
But Turks were, and there was a Baptist preacher, and he was unusual in a lot of ways, but John Leland, and he was like, the Constitution is fantastic. It means that, and he used the term Turk for Muslim. It means Jews, pagans, and Turks were equally free. And that was another thing that they did. Another rhetorical thing to advocate this expanded freedom was that Americans were rejecting toleration. And that became very trendy to say, well, England has, and parts of Europe have toleration, but it's always with these limits. The people
Mhm.
who are being tolerated are always sort of second class. Um, they aren't supposed to hold public office in a number of countries. Um, there are all sorts of restrictions sometimes uh,
Mhm.
on how their churches are supposed to look. England didn't have that as strongly as other places, although they imposed that on Catholics. When they legalized Catholic churches in 1778, or decriminalized, or however you phrase it, um, their laws specified that a Catholic church could not have spires and bells. That was a very European thing, where like if Lutheranism was established or Catholicism was the boss religion in a principality in some German state, then it meant that all the other churches could not ring their bells. And if for some reason they it was like a scandal. If the wrong church rang bells, it was pretty horrifying. And in a weird way, there were, I think it was about 20 years ago, there were riots in Egypt because a church in a city that has a very large Christian population, they had the nerve to ring their bells, their church bells. And the thing was, it caused a riot in that Egyptian town because, of course, also under Islamic toleration, churches are not supposed to ring bells. Their worship is supposed to be quiet and unobtrusive. So that's
Oh,
an undercurrent, and that's something we forget about toleration, was that it was very it implied that one religion is top ranking and the others are second rate. And one of the ways that they sort of pushed expanded freedom is by saying, well, we're getting rid of toleration and we're making room for genuine freedom, which meant equality of the different religions. And
I
so
see.
yeah, so that was one little mini battle. At least rhetorically, that meant a lot to people.
I see. So it's kind of like if our country can give people with Islam as their belief system and people with Christianity as their belief system, if they can leave both very different parties to freedom, that's more net freedom overall, as opposed to if everyone living the exact same way is the only way to get to freedom. That's pretty circumscribed, pretty limited. That was the idea. It's more free. The country's more free if more people
Right.
get.
It's
Okay.
more free. And it's weird. You'll hear this same argument coming up, though. There was a Georgia politician, I forgot, Candace, I cannot remember her name, but she's a political figure in Georgia who said that, well, no, religious freedom is there for Christians. It's not there for everybody else. It's like, hey, I guess, you missed it. But, so yeah, it's supposed to be more free. That's a good way of putting it.
Okay. Cool. So we've talked a little bit about thinkers, but and you've already touched on many of these, but what are some of the groups that had the greatest influence on our Constitution, on our founding fathers? What schools of thought were the most important? I think most people start with Christianity. Some people still consider this nation to be purely a Christian country. So, what are some misconceptions about that? How much was Christianity playing a role? How much were other schools of thought and secular schools of thought playing a role in the development of our country?
People speak generically about the Enlightenment, but of course, the Scottish Enlightenment involved a lot of religious figures. So, but the Enlightenment drew a lot from Greek and Roman sort of classical thought, and the Bible. I'd be some people try to see that as like a founding document. I'd be cautious about that. People might overstate the number of people who were deistic, but and that was still a very controversial religion in throughout the founding, which deism was a very stripped down monotheism that tended to reject any sort of revealed written word, whether it was the Bible or the Quran, and just that the order of the universe was more the word of God than any book. So it was very pro-science, at least in theory. So there's that trend. Another problem I see with talking about Christianity and the influence of is that we tend to think that the versions of Christianity that we're familiar with now are the exact same thing, that Christianity is a static thing that has been the same thing for 2,000 years. And it simply hasn't. Christianity hasn't been the same thing for 50 years, let alone for 200 years.
Mhm.
The Christianity of the founders was extremely important to them, but in some ways it would be unacceptable today. And the big thing that is, I think, unacceptable, for instance, is that a lot of their days of prayer were days of fasting and humiliation, where Americans were asked to take a day off and think about how wrong we are. And the way people went um, maniacally offended when they thought Obama was going on an apology tour. Like you can never. I always think that I think that a part of the right has borrowed something from, and I was a fan of the show, uh, NCIS. The character um, Gibbs, one of his rules is never apologize. It's a sign of weakness. I think some people have taken that as stronger than any Bible verse. Like you can
Oh
never admit
yeah.
you're wrong. You can never admit that the country's wrong. But a lot of their days of prayer were based on the premise that, oh, we're in the wrong. And even during the revolution, you see it in personal letters too. I forgot one of a member of the Continental Congress was getting a letter from his wife, and his wife said, you know, that this war, and she was speaking for a lot of people, felt this, and you saw this a lot, even in the days in the declarations of a day of fasting during the war and the protests that led up to the revolution. That if we were in a war, even if we thought our grievances were just, if there was bloodshed, that was a sign of God's judgment, and we're a sinful, awful people. And that's something that today, a day of prayer is jubilant. It's
Sure.
not like we're going to take a day and think about how horrible we are.
Hmm.
That's like a sin to admit that you're wrong.
Hmm.
And I think that is something that is very different. Their Christianity was very different from ours because it believed in repentance, which of course means admitting that you're wrong in the first place.
Hmm.
And I think Abigail Adams wrote to her husband, John Adams, saying, you know, we have yet, and this is like in 1775 when when the violence was getting more pronounced. And she goes, we have yet to pay for the sin of slavery. And that's something that Abraham Lincoln would pick up in one of his, I think it was his second inaugural address, that that bloodshed in war was punishment for slavery. And he believed that, well, you know, there's a poetic, and I'm going to brutalize it, but he said that every drop of blood that was drawn from the lash was going to get paid for with blood in the war. And the war was simply America paying for the sin of slavery. And I think the idea that modern Americans would never allow a prominent figure to say that we're in war because we're a horrible people.
I see.
And that would be the end of your political career, I think.
Sure.
But
So, what do you think happened to this ability of our people to acknowledge that we've made mistakes? What went wrong? Why aren't we doing that anymore? Why aren't we brandishing ourselves?
yeah, I'll tell you one thing that struck me as weird, and you think of it as a modern thing, but during the congressional debates over Chinese exclusion, you had, and the guy's name was Miller, and he said, "Please don't think that we're narrow-minded." The crazy thing about American racists is that they don't want anybody to think that they're racist. And you think that that's, oh, this is a modern thing, that's a post 1960s thing. It's like this was in the 1800s. People who were advocating shutting our borders to most China, except for like the richest China, to shutting our borders to Chinese labor, would wanted to make sure that nobody thought they were bigoted or narrow-minded. It's like this is the
Yeah.
weirdest thing.
Why is that? I mean, yeah.
That one, I can only say that that tendency is there, but I can't say when that started.
Yeah.
But
It's it's interesting because not so long ago we had someone go on stage, give an interesting salute, and
yeah,
then go on Twitter and say, "I don't know. I'm just autistic. I don't know what happened. I hate. I don't like not equivocate in the strangest way." So, but that is interesting. A lot of people I've heard a lot of people talk about this weird tendency to want to take a huge stride into pleasing one side, and just blatantly racist stuff, and then backpedaling afterward. Like, just own it.
yes.
Have a belief. Maybe having real beliefs isn't convenient for people in politics, but
Right.
it's pretty. It can alienate people. So better stay in the middle on everything. But
Right.
anyway, let's see. Um, Another thing I wanted to ask you about is about what are some misconceptions people have about the founding fathers, and the Constitution, and the intentions of all these documents and these important developments.
It's weird to agree on some things with both the left and the right.
Mm-hmm.
And the left is right that a lot of America is founded on stealing the land, stealing labor, and exploitation, brutal exploitation. Of course, we're not happy to reflect on that. It's not the most joyous thing to examine, but it's there and we have to look at it. Uh, and then the right is super uncomfortable with the expansiveness of it, that anybody of any religion or perhaps no religion at all could run for office, which I keep going back to, but I think that is kind of a big deal, even if it wasn't in reality an easy thing for somebody to have done. I mean, we've only had two Catholic presidents,
Mm.
which is kind of weird.
Who were they? Out of curiosity.
JFK and Biden.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah, but people
That's right.
think, and people forgot that about Biden, but having a second president of a group is as important as having the first one.
Mm.
Like, oh, that's great. We had Obama.
Mm.
It's going to be great when we have our third African American president, and it's not even an issue.
Sure, sure.
That's going to be a huge. That's when we've actually gotten somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm stealing the importance of that from Malcolm Gladwell, who a few years ago, and this has become less true because a few of these countries have since then had women leaders, but there were a number of major American cities that had their first African American mayor. You rent the confetti shooter, that's great. But a decade later, he was giving the speech around 2011 or 12. This goes back a little bit. And he got, but they haven't had a second African American mayor. And then there's several countries that had their first woman president or woman prime minister, had their first woman prime minister, but haven't had a second. And that changed. But one of his examples was Britain. They had Margaret Thatcher, and then it was decades they didn't have anybody. And think, oh, well, then since that speech, they had Theresa May. But remember, nobody going to the polls in that election thought that they would wind up with a woman prime minister.
Mm-hmm.
It was the pie throwing scene in at the end of every Three Stooges, where somebody ducks and the pie hits them in the face. That is how Theresa May became prime minister. There were two or three men that if one side wins this election, everybody thought, well, here's the dude that's going to do it, who's going to be prime minister for that side. And because they thought that they wouldn't win, the guy goes, nah, I don't want it. And then I think they went through like two dudes who would have been represented that side. And they were like, no, thanks. And then Theresa May, they ducked, and Theresa May got the pie in the face and became prime minister. Absolutely, at that point, she was not going through that whole election cycle thinking, I'm almost there. Nobody thought Theresa May was going to be prime minister.
Mm-hmm.
Theresa May did not, until she got that phone call, think that she was going to be prime minister. I don't think.
Mm.
So that was an absolute accident that they got their second woman prime minister.
Mm.
Was not something they wanted. And actually, they hated her off it turns out there were a lot of reasons to not be happy with Theresa May.
Mm.
But yeah, but that was the exception. That was, yeah, Britain had its second woman prime minister, but totally on accident and involuntarily.
Mm-hmm.
So it's weird. So a lot of times you'll have what he drew a distinction between a token and then a pioneer, or I'm going to use the wrong term, but somebody who goes through the door and closes it behind them.
Ah.
Somebody who goes and holds the door.
Ah.
And it's not always in their power to do that.
Mm-hmm.
It's not always up to the person going in, whether or not they're going to wind up being a token or whether they're going to be holding the door. It's not always their choice. But yeah, it's up to a lot to the voters. Are they going to make that person, okay, we're going to let this happen once just to prove we're not racist. But we're never, just to prove that we're not sexist. And then it'll be another 100 years.
Yeah. Wow. No, that's an interesting thought. I never really thought about that too much.
Yeah, it's weird one. I do like when people pick an odd thread that you didn't even notice was out of whack. But yeah, that one was an eye opener.
Yeah. Cool. Trying to remember how we got there. Hey, fuck it. Let's move on. So another thing I wanted to ask you about was this idea of democracy that we champion so much and we're so proud of in this nation and everywhere. First of all, what is a democracy? I mean, I know what it means most literally, but what is it supposed to mean in a country like America with 300 million people or whatever? What do you think it's supposed to be all about, and how have we deviated from it?
Wow. And again, I'm borrowing from a writer who called attention to this.
Sure.
But Washington wanted a high level of representation in the House of Representatives, mm-hmm. where it was instead of a representative per 100,000, he wanted a representative for like 10,000 mm-hmm. per 10,000 people. It would be a huge. And people say, oh, but and I said, yeah, they need to expand the number of people in the House of Representatives. And somebody said, well, you couldn't get anything done if there were like 1,000 members or 3,000 members. I'm thinking, well, what are they getting? You know what I mean? So since when is that an argument? That's
yeah.
Stuff done now.
Right.
But so we have thrown the brakes on a lot of representation, mm-hmm. even though the original intent, they really did draw a distinction between a republic and a democracy. They really saw democracy as mob rule, but we've gotten more representative, but we fight it with really scientific gerrymandering, where they surgically draw these maps to make sure that if you control your state now, you will for several decades.
Mhm.
Um, and and then there's the debate over ID laws and things of that nature, and that always try to put some kind of filter on who can even get to vote. Um, oh, well, I think the issue, well, I think it was in Alabama, the issue was, well, yeah, you required driver's licenses. And on the surface, that's fair. All you got to do is go to the DMV and get your license. And then coincidentally, they started closing down a bunch of the DMV offices in certain areas.
Ah,
So, oh, so it remained easy for some people to get their license renewed.
sure.
And then somehow it was like you had to take a day off work to travel several miles
Mhm.
if you were in another demographic group. And
Mhm.
it's like, yeah, so there's that. Um,
So we want democracy to be government by the people, and what we get a lot of times is government by some people.
right,
Sure,
exactly. By
sure.
the people always means our people, whoever, if you're if you're in the boss demographic, which has historically been white Protestants and now expanding into just white Christians generically. But
Why
yeah,
are Protestants? What? Why does that work so well? Why are they in these? Is it a coincidence, or why do they always seem to be at such an in such an influential position?
for a while it was their country. And we talk about quotas at schools. Some of the first quotas at the Ivy League schools was that the quota for Jewish students
Yeah,
would be the maximum number. So we weren't going to have more than, I'm going to pull a number out of the hat,
sure.
a small percentage or a small number. Like they were only going to accept, I don't know, 10 or 50, whatever it is, 10 Jewish students. So that was the quota. We're going to hit this number and and that is it. And then the door is closed. A lot of our top schools started as seminaries for Protestant ministers. So that's some of the Ivy League. The earlier the degrees you could get were law, divinity, and medical. And we didn't have a ton of medical schools. Um, Medical is a sort of a late comer to the PhD category. Somebody said that was initially a humanities degree, but it was so that's one way that the Protestants have always been. Numerically, they've been on top as far as that goes for a good bit. And in different regions, it's been different types of white Protestants. And they've had very competing. It was, the leadership of the Confederacy and the Union, where, you were largely looking at Protestant versus Protestant.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, they were the gatekeepers of a lot of big institutions,
Mhm.
the universities, to an extent, the government. Um, that began to fall down at the municipal level, where Irish immigrants began to take over the cities, and WASP sort of pulled out of, say, Boston and other cities. And by the early 1900s, uh, it was on from where my family's from. One was upstate New York or Western New York rather, and one from New England. And the pattern was the same in the two regions. Buffalo was like tons of Catholics. You had Italians and Poles. And if you wanted to see Protestants outside of African Americans who began arriving in Buffalo around and after World War II. But white Protestants, you had to drive out to the small towns around Buffalo. And it's the same in a lot of New England towns. It's the Protestants just sort of withdrew. And
Mhm.
so the city governments began to be Catholic run.
Mhm.
And then you had the battles between this. Protestants still controlled the state government of Massachusetts. So they'd argue about, well, who's going to control the schools in Boston? Is it going to be the Catholics who run the city, or are we going to make this something that the state takes over? So there was then the battle between the city and the state governments. And that's also something you're seeing in Florida too, where Governor DeSantis is trying to undermine what measures local policymakers can make, whether it's environmental or anything else. And the weird thing is that a lot of Florida went through COVID okay, and it was because even cities with Republican mayors, like ours did, we had a Mayor Curry who was Republican during much of the COVID situation, and he pursued pretty middle of the road policies. He didn't go full on bleach injection on. He was realistic about it. And so DeSantis wants to brag about how the state did well. The state did well because a lot of the state wasn't in with him on denying that anything was happening. You know what I mean? That he was more of a Trumpian when it came to COVID. But at the city level, practical measures were being taken. And that was happening. And that's why Florida had some healthy results. So, but it's all very, it's so yeah, that is real interesting about the Protestant thing and how they were able to, it's very weird. It's very weird. And what's weird now is that the Catholics that are rising to prominence are ideologically and culturally very similar to the more extreme Protestants. Harrison Butker he is big COVID like anti-COVID measures. He's very much a fan of the trad wife movement. Like his speech was like a few notches away from get your compound with your wives and your guns. And like he was a few notches away from survivalist nut jobbery. But that's kind of there is a whole brand of Catholicism that it goes to the Latin Mass. It's mad. The way the right is mad about the 1960s over the culture and the civil rights legislation, these conservative Catholics are mad about Vatican II, which was a reform in Catholicism in the 1960s. And it, among other things, it allowed vernacular mass so that the mass would be English, and an English speaking area it could be, whatever the local language might be. And Butker is a big advocate or part of a movement that's a big fan of the Latin Mass. Other fans of it are going to be Mel Gibson, whose father is kind of a disbeliever in the Holocaust, but he is a believer in the Latin Mass, apparently. So it's a very weird way that the new Catholic ascendancy is a very weird cultural ripoff of far right Protestants. It's creepy. It's very weird. And that's like, I'm from an ethnically Irish Catholic family, but a lot of us have been atheists for decades. So, but culturally, we still think of ourselves as Irish Catholic. I guess it's like being a Jewish atheist. Culturally, you're still one thing, but but it's something weird's going on. It's weird to think about how entrenched the Protestants were, and something's happening in Catholicism that I've been too removed from it for too long to viscerally know what's going on, but it's weird. It's really weird.
For the next segment, what I really wanted to ask you about was I wanted to ask you about war a little bit, because whenever people talk about history, it just keeps coming up, and I was wondering why that is, and then I realized it's kind of a lot of what we've done, and it's a lot of the most impactful things that humans have done on this planet is kill each other in really impressive ways. Just as a little hook, so to speak, what are some of the most atrocious things you've heard about happening in war? American actions would be interesting, but worldwide.
Ooh, a very ugly trend. This was something like I was not a Civil War buff,
Sure.
but there was a trend about 3 years ago of people raising a blackened American flag, and they said their example was some Confederate units
Mm.
that would raise a black flag, not a blackened American flag, but just a black. And I thought, what are they even talking about? Because I like my thing is the 1700s. I don't know where they're coming from with this was a what I thought was an obscure reference. There were Now I had heard of Fort Pillow, a battle. You got to put battle in quotes. There was a brief engagement, but it's most famous for the massacre that happened shortly after the battle. The white and black United States troops were driven to the nearby river, and a turn happened where the Confederates decided they would start taking prisoners. But as one Confederate veteran said, um, the were whites were taken prisoner, but black soldiers were shown no mercy. And it became a slaughter of African Americans. But not only of the soldiers, there are reports that the women and children who would have been support staff, cooks, laundresses, the wives of soldiers, like slaughtered. Some drowned when chased into the river. Others were probably outright directly murdered. But the thing was, Fort Pillow wasn't some kind of one time thing. That at battle after battle, the black casualties were horrific, and even those that were okay. Something gruesome that's happened in a lot of wars I thought was unusual in that I heard about some of the survivors, the Americans that were taken prisoner after Bunker Hill, were mostly wounded people because everybody else, it was a Pyrrhic victory for the British, but it was
Just what again? I'm sorry, I forgot what that meant. Pyrrhic victory.
It was from a Roman battle where they defeated one of their enemies. Well, no, like their enemy won that battle, but it's such a high cost that he really couldn't fight again.
I see. Okay.
It was all over for him. So the British won this hill, which strategically meant nothing. They lost a ton of men, enlisted men, but they lost some very illustrious officers that just were a huge number of highly esteemed officers died in this battle. So they won this hill, but at such a staggering cost that psychologically it showed that that Americans and that New England's got a rap that they can't put up a fight, and this was like, oh, I guess they can. Um, and that was another misconception that sort of dogged the Union during the Civil War. But one of the things that happened to those prisoners was there was a rumor that there were these botched amputations, and which is so gruesome. There were stories circulating in the prison, like one of the civilian prisoners said that it was said that the limbs were rotten, and I thought that's so weird because you don't hear that a lot. And then I began to hear that there were rumors about the Battle of Olustee in Florida. which is not terribly far from Jacksonville,
Mhm.
my hometown. And it, there were several people, Union and Confederate, who thought, African American veterans of that kind of got a lot of amputations, and I'm not sure all of them were necessary. And it's like, and then another Union person, a white guy at a Confederate camp said African American veterans are beginning to arrive, and a lot of them have been butchered, have received these horrible amputations from Confederate surgeons. Like that amputation seems to have been a horrible thing. And it's something that's come up. It came up in the medical experiments about the Empire of Japan and Nazi Germany during World War II. Amputations, sorry, I just got a notification. My phone battery's low. Amputations as part of their medical experiments was a big thing by both Japan and Germany.
Mhm.
Notorious war crime level medical experiments, some of them involving amputation. And it
Mhm.
came up in the Gaza war. A lot of whistleblowers,
Recently?
yeah, after October 7th, from a number of, there have been a number of Israeli personnel as well as survivors said that a lot of um, Palestinian detainees have been cuffed so long that ultimately they need amputation. And it's like uh, amputation has become an issue, and then there's been denials, but a lot of whistleblowers have said, yeah, something ugly is going on here. And the weird way that amputation as at least a rumored war crime just keeps coming up. I did not expect that. When people say, I didn't expect that on my bingo card. I didn't expect it to be a theme that kept coming up again and again and again. I thought,
Yeah,
oh, that is a one-time thing after Bunker Hill.
sure.
It's like, no, this like that keeps happening. Of all
Wow.
the job things you think you're going to repeat, that was ugly.
Yeah, that is wild. Is your phone gonna die? Do you need to plug it in?
Oh yeah, pardon me a second, and I'll be right back.
No problem, bro.
Thank you.
Sure.
Sorry.
All good?
There we go. So that was something I wasn't expecting to come up a lot was amputations.
Yeah.
Uh,
Um, yeah, crazy stuff. I heard in a unit 731 or whatever in Japan, they were cutting off I heard of one experiment where they would cut off they would have two twins, they'd cut off the arm of one and put it on the other and put the other's arm on the what was the point?
I
You know?
know,
Like
right?
in research we talk about how we wish we could make like fake humans so we could do really crazy human subjects experiments where we could learn all this crazy stuff about brains and Alzheimer's and all this stuff. And they were just fucking around. Like they had this golden opportunity to, well, okay, I shouldn't put it like that, we'll cut that out anyways. I'll let that thought go. um so let's see, what of this am I most interested in hearing about from you today? Okay, so this war thing that we always do all the time, do you
Yeah.
think everyone always has to ask this when war comes up, but do you think this is this is a human evolution monkey thing, or do you think it's just something that it's a cultural thing that's played out so many times that we just feel like we have to resort to it? And what trends have you noticed and what has caused war over time? It used to maybe be about gold. Sometimes it seems to be about ideas. What are the patterns and what seems to drive people to war? Why war?
there's a wealth of literature that looks at so-called primitive warfare or early warfare, and I haven't taken the dive into that yet. I'm suspecting it's a little genetic. There are troops of chimpanzees that will go on violent, sort of genocidal sprees against other troops,
Wow.
against other groups. Yeah, and but there's sometimes violence in a number of species that is culturally. There was a study of a South African preserve where they were trying to limit the number of elephants, so they thought they would kill off the older ones. And what they had was a bunch of, you know, I'm going to say delinquent teenagers without adult supervision that were committing hate crimes. They would randomly murder rhinos. They would they really became horrible. And what the park realized was they had to bring in a big adult father figures to police these juvenile delinquents. So the problem started with human intervention, and it had to be corrected with a demographic balance within, with the parents, the elders still being there.
Mm.
Um, and so it's a little bit of two different things at the same time.
Mhm.
Sometimes it could be something in our genes that we're just going to fight and eventually resort to violence. And other times you can screw up a society so much that you get that sort of other sort of violence. Juvenile delinquent that's also hate crime. That it's so I think it's going to be both factors. And
Sure.
there was a one professor, he was a University of North Florida professor who wrote a book called Violent Land. And his introduction is all about that biology has a bigger role in human history than we want to admit. And then you read the rest of the book, and it's like, yes, males have a slightly higher propensity to violence, higher propensity to violence. Women, there's that. But what you see again and again and again is that cultural and political factors will always make that worse.
Mm.
Racism will always make violence worse. Um, Messing around with gender ratios will make things worse, but it's often going to be laws that do it. The, the Page Act of 1875, essentially, it was an anti-prostitution act, anti-human trafficking law, but it effectively meant that most Chinese women were not going to be allowed into the United States, which meant also, there were also laws against mail order buys. There were laws against, at the state level, there would be laws against interracial marriage, as well as racist barriers to it. So that basically Chinese immigrants were sentenced to be perpetual bachelors. And what that led to was they became notorious for gambling and drugs. And it's like, well, they didn't have the civilizing influence of a healthy home life, for a lot of them, at least is the theory he presented. So a lot of times racism and laws will interfere in society and make violence more likely. Uh, but war, that's a good question. It's awful tied to a lot of even our laws are rooted in both religious and racial bigotry. The whole status of illegal combatant, that was really developed in medieval. Christian thought about war with Muslims, that they are taking some line from Deuteronomy that people from outside of your faith community don't have the right to fight you. They don't have a right to put up a fight. So any of the laws that we have protecting prisoners of war simply don't extend to them because they're not legal combatants. Well, that whole category of illegal combatants was once religious based. And then it got reinforced in the Netherlands, where the Catholic Spanish were fighting rebels who were mostly Protestant. And so, well, you see, they're heretics. They're not just fighting against a political end. They're not just fighting against a prince, an earthly prince. They're fighting against God. And so, just like Muslims, a rebel is like a heretic. He's somebody who's outside. He's not protected by the rules of law. So you can do horrible things to this whole category because they're not covered by humanitarian law. And whether or not war is eventually going to happen, we have whole categories set up where our rules aren't supposed to extend, and it all goes back to some sort of bigotry.
Mhm.
And that's very weird to me.
Sure.
But I guess that's I think an unspoken thing about American life is that, yeah, race does have something to do with it. It's why we can't have nice things. It's
Mhm.
why we don't have good mass transit like a bullet train. It's like why a lot of municipalities don't have great public transportation.
Mhm.
And people have made this, I haven't, I'll admit to a thought. I haven't even read Project, 1619 yet, but I know that the arguments based on that we can look at our healthcare system, and the reason we don't have healthcare system is because of racism.
Mhm.
So war may not be natural, but it's always going to be uglier when you add religious bigotry or racial bigotry. That's
Mhm.
always going to make it uglier.
Mhm.
But anyway,
Yeah. So it's like we kind of have this built-in tendency to classify and view the world as, self, us, and then other. And then from there, we start to have these really weird cognitive distortions where we think the other deserves to be treated differently. Maybe, and then I noticed that there's a problem with dehumanizing them and no longer viewing others as part of your same species. And then it seems to easily devolve into war. I mean, it wouldn't be that hard to, for me, if a roach kind of treaded on me slightly, it wouldn't be hard for me to smush it to death, right? Because
yeah.
it's not one of us. It's not a human. It's not of great importance. So yeah, it kind of makes sense that we might have a predisposition inside of us, and then you add in racism and people constantly corroborating each other's hatred, and people getting into circle jerks of hatred. It seems
Yeah.
natural that the progression would be start killing them off in mass.
Your mention of that and the neurology and the category, we think in categories.
Mm-hmm.
Did we may have talked about this years ago, but do you remember David Eagleman's study? He did a program for PBS that was in conjunction with a book called The Brain.
Yes, great book.
Yeah, and one of the experiments they did, and you can tell he was still in shock when he described it,
Mm.
was that they showed people, they put them in a brain scan, and they showed footage of a hand being punctured by a hypodermic needle.
Mm.
And the same part of the brain that would light up if I were stabbed or poked, if I felt pain, a certain part of my brain would light up.
Yes.
Same part of my brain would light up if I saw somebody else getting hurt. And that was a tremendous sign of sympathy. Just like you can neurologically see where people feel sympathy.
Mm.
But then they did something really weird. They introduced, I think it was a total of 5 labels, and they included Muslim, Jewish, Scientologist, Hindu, and like 5 different religious labels. And the absolute crazy thing is, if I saw a hand getting punctured and the label wasn't my label, I was less likely to feel it.
Wow.
And it isn't about my voluntarily. My brain did not light up. And it wasn't and they said the results would vary, but it wasn't like one group stood out as more human. It's like it was across every group was affected by this,
Hmm.
more or less. And like you had
Wow.
some individuals who might not have been like, but in general, there was a big difference. If that label wasn't you, you were less likely to feel anything. And it was like, oh my God. And so that's why I'm always going to caution against people who throw labels
Yeah.
like legal combatant. People started throwing that around during the torture debate
And
as
what
if
does that mean? I'm sorry. I don't know what that means.
um, one of the arguments around 2007 when the Bush administration was going to try to justify things like waterboarding, all of this was, and then you would have commentators like Ann Coulter pick up on, well, illegal
Piece of
combat.
shit. And Coulter, by the way.
Yeah, no
Anyway, go ahead.
kidding. Yeah. And the claim was, and this was, they were saying about illegal combatants the same thing that some British officers were saying about the word rebel, because it is basically the same label. This is a person who isn't legally supposed to be in a war at all. And so you can simply shoot them on sight. This isn't a person who it gets taken prisoner. He's not even lawfully supposed to be there. So he has no rights. And anything you do to him is, well, if you haven't killed him all outright and you've let him live, you've done him more of a favor than he deserves. And what was absolutely, and this is the other lesson of history is that we never learn from history. We're just that even if you study history, you're on the same train wreck as everybody who didn't. And that seems to be a repeating theme as well. But yeah, so illegal combatant was a label that people could throw. Once I put that word up there, I can shut off the sympathetic part of my. I don't have to care about how bad waterboarding is or how bad stress positions are or anything like that or sleep deprivation. I don't have to think about that or feel anything because I've got a one-word label here or a two-word label. I've got a label here I can put on that person and I can just shut off that part of my brain. I don't
Sure.
have to feel sympathy.
Sure.
And, you know, and it's just, and you'll find the same thing, and they're going to rush to say, if you talk about illegal immigrants, it's like, okay, it, it, and it doesn't, it's just throwing a switch. And
Mm.
uh, so I really try to caution people about not using labels like that. And it's almost impossible to do, but when
Sure.
you find yourself constantly hammering on it, you don't join that chorus because it's going to lead to bad things.
Sure. That makes a whole lot of sense. And that study by Dr. Eagleman is that's a beautiful study. Not the results were beautiful, but it's but the fact how much about being a human was captured in one study. I love when science mirrors life, kind of like art's supposed to imitate life. Science can do that too. I love when that happens. I love when the study's not about one receptor interacting with some arbitrary molecule in a rat model. I like
Right.
that study says a lot about us at such a grand scale. That's fascinating. Thanks for reminding me of that.
Oh, thank you.
Um, so I kind of wanted to end this on because I think you and I are both rather cynical human beings. Uh, I get, or that's the vibe I get. I could be wrong, but I want to ask, like, so you know a lot more about America than most people. What are the strengths of this country? What are the strengths of this country that remain? And how can we kind of have hope for the future? A lot of people are stressed right now, even on, and so what's good? What do we have to look forward to or hope for?
There's always backlash to progress, and sometimes it lasts a long time. The backlash to Reconstruction, that basically lasted from about 1875 to like 1968,
Mm.
and where freedom was had for several years and then taken away.
Mm.
And then there's another wave of backlash. Our immigration laws, a similar thing. The 1924 Immigration Act was a nightmare. Um, it was a preemptive assist to the Holocaust
Mm.
because one of the advocates of it said there's going to be a wave of persecution in Europe, and we need to close the door now because Jews are going to be running for their lives, and basically we don't want to let them in here. And he was wrong because he thought this would happen in Russia, which is a good guess because lots of horrible things had been done to Jews in Russia. Not a bad guess. But of course, it turned out to be Germany. Uh, but that 1924 law saw the Holocaust coming and said, just lock the doors now and don't let them in. And that is anytime somebody yells about the 1965 thing, they got rid of quotas. That was a hate, that law was is so evil. I don't think it can be underestimated. It even made Japan worse. It shut off Japanese immigration, and it was one of the levers right around 1925, a year after that law. Japan began getting, other factors were involved, but our immigration laws made Japan more racist on the eve of World War II. And it's like anyway. So, I'm supposed to be pointing to bright things. The bright thing is that ultimately you had the 1965 Immigration Act, which undid it.
Sure.
And now we're seeing a backlash against our more open policy.
Right.
This is going to go back and forth, but it isn't about passively waiting for, well, the tide will turn. The tide will turn if we make it turn.
Okay.
And that is one lesson that Washington's Crossing pointed. David Hackett Fisher, a Brandeis historian, who mentions that he is from the separation of church and state Protestant tradition, but he says that they believed in a type of fatal. It was sort of, I can't remember the phrase he used, but like an active fatalism, like things are on our side. Providence might be on our side, but you still have to get off your behind and do something.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that is active fatalism. Like the arc of the universe bends towards justice,
Mm-hmm.
but we have to do a lot of the bending. We have
Sure.
to we have to grab it and make it follow that course.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that active, like, yeah, it's going to get stinking, but you can do this. It's been done before, and yep, we're gonna have another cycle where we have to fight against our lower instincts, and we're gonna have to keep doing this. But this isn't the first time it happened. It isn't the first time that the bad guys and the fear triumphed over friendliness. But we just got to keep pushing,
Mm-hmm.
and we can see good things happen again.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where the hope comes from.
Mm-hmm. So you're of the belief that the good guys usually win. It just takes a while, but an active effort, under the circumstances of an active effort, the good guys win. You're saying.
Amen. That's what I would say.
Thank you, Brian. That makes me happy for a couple seconds. That's cool.
Yes.
That's nice. Love
Again,
it.
we do need those flotation devices psychologically.
Yeah, no doubt, man. Well, we really
It's
touched.
always a
Oh, go
pleasure
ahead.
talking to you. You're awesome.
It's a pleasure talking to you, man. Thank you so much for doing this. I think we touched on everything I wanted to. So, yeah,
Okay. Glad to
cool.
hear it.
All right. Well, viewers wise, thank you so much for tuning in to the fourth episode of this. I hope there can be more, and I hope you learned. You had to have learned something. You didn't know all that shit. So, have a wonderful rest of your days.